Hey guys. Okay, let's get started. That way we can all take the quiz and be ready for this week, which is our last week before the exam next week, or at least taking the exam before Tuesday of next week. So this is the last chapter that we need to study for on this specific exam. And it's 4 chapters. So bear that in mind. There's going to be more material than last exam, but that's another conversation. I may do a study hall just for the exam that covers all the material from all the quizzes. Yeah, I think that's what we're going to do. That way we don't waste all our time today talking about what will be and just focus on what is right now. All right, so we only have 10 more pages and we're done. Let's get this over with. Yeah, all right. So last time we ended on talking about the Milgram's research study with the participants that thought they were shocking someone to the point of death. XXX was the highest level. And that was in relation to the third form of conformity. They talked about oh my gosh, the thing that they talked about conformity specifically, compliance, and then obedience. And so we're in the obedience section talking specifically about Milgram's research. And they'd mentioned that this was possible because of the obedient participant, the authority, the victim, and the procedure. So we're about to get to the authority, the second of 4. Yeah, okay. So where is my highlighter? No, I can't get highlighter happy without my highlighter. Guys, this is a travesty. I swear I'm normally prepared for things. I just assumed it was still here. Oh, guys, this is what happens when you don't work on it every day and you take a break. Ugh. You know what? It's fine. It's fine. I have another one. We're just going to use it. Oh my gosh, it was behind me. Not normally a hot mess. That's a lie, I am. Okay, let's just get on with this and pretend like nothing happened. I'm really good at pretending, guys. Okay, so after the obedient participant is the authority, right? What is perhaps most remarkable about Milgram's findings is that an experimenter in a white lab coat is not a powerful figure of authority. Unlike military superiors, employers, coaches, teachers, or president, the experimenter in Milgram's research could not ultimately enforce his commands. Still, his physical presence and apparent legitimacy play major roles in drawing obedience. I'm going to highlight that. Physical presence and apparent legitimacy. Yeah, play major roles in drawing obedience. When Milgram diminished the experimenter's status by moving his lab from the distinguished surroundings of Yale University to a rundown urban office building in nearby Bridgeport, Connecticut, the rate of total obedience dropped to 48%. When the experimenter was replaced by an ordinary person, supposedly another participant, there was a sharp reduction to 20%. Similarly, Milgram found that when the experimenter was in charge but issued his commands by telephone, Only 21% fully obeyed. In fact, when the experimenter was not watching, many participants in this condition feigned obedience by pressing the 15-volt switch. One conclusion then is clear, at least in Milgram's setting. Destructive obedience requires the physical presence of a prestigious authority figure. If an experiment, I think I'm going to have to highlight that. So, if an experimenter can exert such control over research participants, imagine the control wielded by truly powerful leaders. Whether they are physically present or not, an intriguing field study examined the extent to which hospital nurses would obey unreasonable orders from a doctor. Using a fictitious name, a male physician called several female nurses on the phone and told them to administer a drug to a specific patient. His order violated hospital regulations. The drug was uncommon, the dosage was too large, and the effects could have been harmful. Yet, out of the 22 nurses who were contacted, 21 had to be stopped when they prepared to obey the doctor's orders. Power. It's crazy that we think, oh, power corrupts, but we don't think about the effects that we in turn play into how we perceive that power and how we play into that giving them credence and authority. It's crazy. Okay, so the victim. Situational characteristics of the victim are also important factors in destructive obedience. Milgram noted that Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann felt sick when he toured concentration camps, but only had to shuffle papers from behind a desk to play his part in the Holocaust. Similarly, the B-29 pilot who dropped the atom bomb on Hiroshima in World War II said of his mission, quote, "I had no thoughts except what I was supposed to do." These events suggest that because Milgram's participants were physically separated from the learner, they were able to distance themselves emotionally from the consequences of their actions. That's critical. Because participants were physically separated from the learner, they were able to distance themselves emotionally from the consequences of their actions. So to test the impact of a victim's proximity on destructive obedience, Milgram seated the learner in one of his studies in the same room as a participant. Under these conditions, only 40% fully obeyed. But when participants were required to physically grasp the victim's hand and force it against his will into a metal shock plate, full obedience dropped to 30. These findings represent significant reductions from the 65% baseline. Still, 3 out of 10 participants were willing to use brute force in the name of obedience. Oh, that's chilling. Yeah. I think the best one to highlight in this one, I don't know. There's a lot in this one. I may bracket this whole paragraph so that later when I'm writing my notes up, I summarize it into one sentence because it's kind of all over the place. There's good in almost every single sentence. So instead of highlighting the whole paragraph, I'm just going to summarize it myself when I write up my notes. Okay, so Milgram ran one last variation, never published, that was only recently discovered in Yale University's library, where Milgram's records have been archived for historical purposes. Located in a rundown office building in a nearby city, he called it the bring a friend condition. In this situation, 20 male participants were told to bring a friend, neighbor, family member, or coworker. When they arrived, the two participants drew straws to determine who would be the teacher and who would be the learner. Unbeknownst to the teacher, Milgram then coached the learner on how to play the role and react to the shocks according to script, at times pleading to the teacher by name. Would participants obey less in this version? Yes. Compared to a Wallace as victim condition run in the same location where the full obedience rate was about 50%, the obedience rate in the friend condition was only 15%. Following in the footsteps of some German citizens who defied the Nazi regime by protecting friends, Milgram's participants were indeed capable of resistance when they had a prior relationship with the victim. That is the key sentence. Milgram's participants were indeed capable of resistance when they had prior relationship. Okay, so the procedure. We talked about the obedient participant, the authority, the victim, now the procedure. Finally, there is the carefully scripted situation created by Milgram. Looking at the dilemma that confronted Milgram's participants, Berger in 2014 points to 4 critical aspects of the experimental procedure that contributed to the surprising results. First, participants were led to feel relieved of personal responsibility for the victim's welfare. The experimenter said up front that he was accountable. Berger notes that in a partial replication of Milgram that he more recently conducted, a Milgram-light version to be described later, only 12% of participants who exhibited full obedience gave any indication during their sessions that they bore any sense of responsibility. In fact, when participants are led to believe they were responsible, their level of obedience dropped considerably. So the first one is, first, participants were led to feel relieved of personal responsibility for victims' welfare. The second, the ramifications of felt responsibility are immense. In the military, on Wall Street, and in corporations and other organizations, individuals often occupy positions in a hierarchical chain of command, caught between individuals who make policy and those who carry it out. How personally responsible do those in the middle feel? Wesley Killam and Leon Mann in 1974 examined this issue in an obedience study that cast participants in one of 2 roles: the transmitter, who took orders from the experimenter and passed them on, and the executant, I think. The executant, I think. I don't know. That word, that means the person who executed something. The executant who actually pressed the shock levers. Interesting. As they predicted, transmitters were more obedient and executants less, 54 to 28%. Interesting. Okay, I'm going to highlight cast participants in 2 roles, the definitions of those 2 roles, and as predicted, transmitters were more obedient. The second feature of Milgram's scenario that promoted obedience is the use of gradual escalation in small increments. Participants began the session by delivering mild shocks, then only gradually escalated to voltage levels of high intensity. After all, what's another 15 volts compared to the current level? By the time they realized the frightening implications of what they were doing, for example, choosing to align with the experimenter once the learner protested at 150 volts, it had become more difficult to stop. Yeah, we talked about this a little bit in one of my classes about how, in Germany, the Nazis didn't start with just murder people. Some did, but it was an extreme, rare situation. Um, there were often incidents of violence, incidents of destruction of property, discrimination, but well before gas chambers, there were all the things that slowly escalated. The policies that were enacted to make Jewish people feel unwelcome well before they decided to put them in concentration camps or beat them up in the streets. Maybe not beat them up in the streets, but definitely before putting them in concentration camps, that there was an escalation. And I think that makes sense when you slowly allow the normal of the entire thing to slowly get more and more obscene. It can sometimes feel like overwhelming that all of a sudden you look back and you go, God, how did I get here? Yeah. Derailed, sorry. I think the best one for this one is promoted obedience is the use of gradual escalation in small increments. Yeah. This sequence is much like the foot in the door technique. In Milgram's words, people become integrated into a situation that carries its own momentum. The subject's problem is how to become disengaged from a situation which is moving in an altogether ugly direction. We should point out that obedience by momentum is not unique to Milgram's research paradigm. As reported by Amnesty International, many countries still torture political prisoners, and those who are recruited for the dirty work are trained, in part, through an escalating series of commitments. They know that they have to train them slowly up to being able to do that to another human being. That's crazy. Similarly, police are trained to interrogate crime suspects by trying to get them to make an initial small admission. I was there, followed by increasingly incriminating admissions. I did it. En route to a full narrative confession. According to Berger in 2014, the third feature of Milgram's situation that made it difficult for participants to resist is that participants found themselves in a novel situation unimaginable, like no other that they have been in before. Yep, that's getting highlighted. Participants found themselves in a novel situation. Yep. I'm going to highlight that obedience by momentum little phrase. I like that. I've titled this whole section in my notes, Obedience by Momentum. Okay. So, participants found themselves in a novel situation unimaginable like no other they have been in before. As such, they did not know what the norms were, how others have reacted, or how they were supposed to respond. That is why, in a variation of Milgram's research, in which two Confederates posed as co-participants who refused to continue, the full obedience rate plummeted to 10%. The fourth aspect of the procedure that promoted obedience is that the task was quickly paced. The task was quickly paced. At the outset, Milgram's experimenter instructed participants to work at a brisk pace. Indeed, as one can plainly see in a film that Milgram had produced of his sessions, those who hesitated were immediately prompted to proceed. All this gave participants no time to ponder, consider their values and their options, think about possible consequences, or make careful decisions. I'm going to highlight that too. All this. Yeah, that whole last sentence. Okay, so Milgram in the 21st century. When Stanley Milgram published the results of his first experiment in 1963, at the age of 28, a New York Times headline read, 65% in test blindly obey order to inflict pain. Milgram had pierced the public consciousness and was poised to become an important and controversial figure in psychology and beyond. In a biography, Thomas Blass in 2004 tells of how Milgram became interested in obedience and the impact his studies have had on social scientists. And the impact his studies have had on social scientists, legal scholars, the US military, and popular culture around the world. His book has been translated into 11 languages. Gotta get it into more. Now, in an age filled with threats of global conflict, extremism, fake news, mass shootings, tensions over immigration, breaches to cybersecurity and privacy, and new forms of lethal weaponry, obedience to authority is an issue of such importance that social psychologists all over the world continue to ponder its ramifications. Milgram died in 1984 at the age of 51. Today, a grainy black and white film that Milgram produced in 1965, in which a number of sessions were recorded from a hidden camera, stands as visual proof of this phenomenon. It is clear from looking at this film that this experiment was conducted in another era, a pre-computer, pre-digital era, in which research participants called the young experimenter Sir. Would you see these results be repeated today? Would you obey the commands of Milgram's experimenter? In an effort to answer this question, Dutch researchers Wim Minus and Quinten Rijmakers in 1995 created a different but analogous situation. They constructed a moral dilemma like Milgram's. Rather than order participants to inflict pain, physical pain on someone, however, they ordered them to cause psychological harm. When participants arrived at a university laboratory, they met a Confederate supposedly there to take a test as part of a job interview. If the Confederate passed the test, he'd get the job. If he failed, he would not. As part of a study of performance under stress, the experimenter told participants to distract the test-taking applicant by making an escalating series of harassing remarks. On cue, the applicant pleaded with participants to stop, became angry, faltered, and eventually fell into a state of despair and failed. As in Milgram's research, the question was straightforward. How many participants would obey orders through the entire set of 15 stress remarks, despite the apparent harm caused to a real-life job applicant? In a control group that lacked a prodding experimenter, no one persisted. But when the experimenter ordered them to go on, 92% exhibited complete obedience despite seeing the task as unfair and distasteful. It appears that obedience is a powerful aspect of human nature brought about by the docile manner in which people relate to figures of authority even today. That's interesting. I would have suspected that it was a little lower, not higher. But psychological harm is something you don't really see. If you did physical harm to someone, there are markers, there's evidence, there's physical evidence. But with psychological damage, with psychological pain, there's much less. And so it makes it easier to hide the damage that we cause to other people. I wonder if that is maybe a confounding variable that they didn't consider in this. Yeah. I think I'm going to highlight this entire paragraph. Now, I'm going to highlight, it appears that obedience is a powerful aspect of human nature brought on that whole sentence. Yeah. But I am going to put the little symbol next to this study because I do think it's important, by the Dutch researchers. Yeah. In a second, more direct attempt to revisit Milgram, Berger, in 2009, conducted a partial replication for which he paid $50 to 70 men and women, a diverse group that ranged from 20 all the way to 81 years old, and used the same procedure. In the original experiment, the learner first protested and asked to stop at 150 volts, at which point nearly all participants paused and indicated a reluctance to continue. Some outright refused at this point. Of course, those who did continue, however, most went all the way. On the basis of this finding, Berger followed the Milgram protocol up to 150 volts in order to estimate the number of participants who would have pulled the switch at 450. He also added a condition in which a defiant Confederate, posing as another participant, refused to continue. In light of post-Milgram changes in standards for research ethics, he took additional precautions. He excluded from the study individuals he feared would experience too much stress, and then informed and reminded participants 3 times that they could withdraw from the study at any time without penalty. Despite all that has changed in 45 years, the obedience rate was not appreciably lower. That seems like it's important. In the experiment that Berger modeled, 83% of Milgram's participants had continued past 150 volts. In Berger's more recent study, 70 did the same. It can be estimated, therefore, that 55% would have exhibited full 450 volt obedience in the original experiment if they followed the same trends with their percentages. Further demonstrating that Milgram's findings transcend time and space, other researchers using Berger's method also went on to replicate the basic effect recently and in Poland. Recent replications have drawn a good deal of interest. Alan Elms, in 2009, a graduate student of Milgram's in the 1960s, is cautious about comparing Berger's obedience light procedure to Milgram's, but is pleased to see it revitalize the research program Milgram had initiated. Arthur Miller, in 1986, the author of The Obedience Experiments, voices the same cautious excitement. Blass, in 2009, author of the Milgram biography, The Man Who Shocked the World, sees Berger's experiment as an important milestone that demonstrates the stability and resilience of obedience in human social behavior. I think this paragraph is entirely about other people's perception of research, so I don't think I'm going to highlight anything from it. In contrast, Jean Twenge, in 2009, author of Generation Me, a 2006 book on how Americans have become more self-centered and wholly focused on personal rights, is skeptical of that conclusion that nothing has changed. Making precise comparisons, Twenge notes that relative to an obedience rate of 83% among Milgram's male participants, only 67% of Berger's men exhibited the 150 volt obedience, a decline that is statistically comparable to the alarming change in US obesity rates during the same period of time. Although impressed with the power of Milgram's situation, Twenge is hopeful that destructive obedience is less prevalent today in the 21st century than in the past. So, we have lingering questions, right? Before leaving the Milgram studies, let's consider 2 important questions. Why exactly did Milgram's participants follow orders? And what are the moral implications of their behavior? I think I'm going to highlight that. I'm going to use that for my notes as a header. On the why question, Milgram had theorized that participants were swept up in a situational momentum he had created, leading them to exhibit obedience. What they displayed was not blind obedience, as some commentators have suggested. The personal conflict they experienced was palpable, but it was obedience nevertheless. In contrast, Alex Haslam and Stephen Reicher and their colleagues recently offered an alternative account, an engaged followership explanation of the results. I'm going to highlight that. These researchers theorized that participants shocked the learner because they identified with the scientific enterprise and wanted to both help the experimenter and make a contribution. Because they identified with the scientific enterprise, they wanted to help, make a contribution. Okay. Yeah, that sounds pretty important. I think I'm also going to highlight the theorized that participants were swept up in the situational momentum. So from this perspective, their behavior indicated their engagement in the science, not the obedience to authority. In support of this account, they noted that Milgram's second prod, which appealed to science, the experiment requires that you continue, was followed by more shock to the learner than his fourth prod, which took the form of a strong command. You have no other choice. You must go on. To test this hypothesis in a single new experiment, Haslam and others in 2014 created an online procedure in which they asked participants to engage in a task that involved denigrating certain groups of people in a way that became increasingly unpleasant, much like climbing a shock scale. In this case, they randomly varied which prod came first and found that, as predicted, 64% of participants completed the study after receiving prod 2, the science prod, compared to only 44% who received prod 4, the obedience prod. I think I'm going to highlight that. When they randomly varied the prod that came first, 64 on prod 2 and 44 on prod 4. This is an interesting result, but for two reasons. It represents only a weak test of the obedience hypothesis. First, you have no choice is exactly the kind of command phrase that arouses psychological reactance and leads people in general to refuse an order to protect their threatened freedom. Second, the participants completed this task via computer without the physical presence of an authority figure, which Milgram had shown to be necessary, obedience or engaged followership. It will be interesting to see what new analyses and studies will be conducted to distinguish these possible explanations. To this day, the debate continues. Interesting. I may also put a little right around that. Okay. So then there is the moral question. By providing a situational explanation for the evils of Nazi Germany or modern day terrorism, do social psychologists unwittingly excuse the perpetrators? Does focusing on situational forces let them off the hook of responsibility? Since many of Milgram's participants were disobedient, indicating that they were free to choose resistance, one would hope not. Andrew Monroe and Glenn Reeder in 2014 note that observers integrate information about the participant, his or her behavior, and the situation in a manner that accounts for the subtle nature of the participant's motives in light of the dilemma. Quote, as caught between wanting to help the learner and wanting to placate the experimenter. So we assess our situation more. What's dangerous to us? What's more important to us? What's more important to them? Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. I think Observers integrate information, accounts for the subtle nature of the participants' motives. Oh, sorry. They know the observers integrate information about the participant, his or her behavior, and the situation in a manner that accounts for the subtle nature of the participant's motives in light of the dilemma. Yeah, I think that's the best sentence. In a series of studies, Miller and others in 1999 found that after people were asked to come up with explanations for acts of wrongdoing, they tended to be more forgiving of those who committed the acts, and they were seen as more forgiving of others. This appearance of forgiveness was certainly not Milgram's intent, nor was it the intent of other researchers today who seek to understand human cruelty, even while continuing to condemn it. Miller and his colleagues were thus quick to caution, to explain is not to forgive. I think that's the most succinct little thing. To explain is not to forgive. Okay. So we talked about the lingering questions that this study left us with, and now they want to talk about defiance, why people rebel. History books will call it the Arab Spring. On December 17th, 2010, a young, unemployed, frustrated Tunisian man by the name of Mohamed Bouazizi set fire to himself in protest after police confiscated the fruits and vegetables he was selling on the street because he lacked a permit. That's awful. Sorry. I have a bit of an empathetic heart. Empathetic, sorry. Almost immediately, men and women took to the streets in protest. Despite the government's determination to suppress dissent, the crowds grew in size, marching, holding rallies, and demanding the resignation of the prime minister. On January 14th, 2011, not even a month later, the government was overthrown and set off protests in other countries throughout the Middle East. No wonder the regimes in power sought to censor and block the social media. Reading Milgram's research, it is easy to despair in light of the impressive forces that compel people toward blind obedience. But there's also good news. I like that sentence. That's a good summary of this whole section on Milgram's research. It can be easy to despair, but there is also good news. Just as social influence processes can breed subservience to authority, social influence processes can also breed rebellion and defiance. The Arab Spring is a modern-day example. A similar phenomenon was seen during World War II. In Resistance of the Heart, historian Nathan Stoltzfus, I think, in 1996, described a civil protest in Berlin in which the non-Jewish wives of 2,000 newly captured Jews congregated outside the prison. The women were there initially to seek information about their husbands. Soon, they were filling the streets, chanting and refusing to leave. After 8 straight days of protests, the defiant women prevailed. Fearing the negative impact on public opinion, the Nazis backed down and released the men. In addition to the role of social networking media, studies indicate that for better or for worse, synchrony of behavior For an example, walking in step with others, clapping, singing, chanting, raising arms in unison. Yep, that's another subtle key term right there. The synchrony of behavior can have a unifying effect on people, increasing the tendency to follow what others are doing. In one study, pairs of participants were seated in rocking chairs side by side and asked to rock in unison. Other pairs also rocked, but they could not see each other and were not in rhythm. Those in the synchrony condition were later more in sync when working jointly to move a steel ball through a wooden maze. Other studies have shown that acting in unison with others can also increase our tendency to feel socially connected, to cooperate for the common good, and even comply with a request to aggress against another person. Are the actions of a whole group harder to control than the behavior of a single individual? Consider the following study. Pretending to be part of a marketing research firm, William Gamson and others in 1982 recruited people to participate in a supposed discussion of community standards. Scheduled in groups of 9, participants were told that their discussions would be videotaped for a large oil company that was suing the manager of a local service station who had spoken out against higher gas prices. After receiving a summary of the case, most participants sided with the station manager, but there was a hitch. The oil company wanted evidence to win its case, said the experimenter posing as the discussion coordinator. He told each of the group members to get in front of the camera and express the company's viewpoint. Then he told them to sign an affidavit giving the company permission to edit the tapes for use in court. To edit whatever you say? You can see how the obedience script was supposed to unfold. Actually, only one of the 33 groups even came close to following the script. In all others, people were incensed by the coordinator's behavior and refused to continue. Some groups were so outraged that they planned to take action. One group even threatened to blow the whistle on the firm by calling the local newspapers. Faced with one emotionally charged mutiny after another, the researchers had to discontinue the experiment. Damn right. Tell people, oh, we need your help to cheat someone else out of it. Come on. So why did this study produce such active, often passionate revolt when Milgram's revealed such utterly passive obedience? Could it reflect a change in values from the 1960s? When Milgram studies were run, many college students believed that people would conform less today than in the past. But an analysis of obedience studies has revealed that there is no correlation between the year a study was conducted and the level of obedience that it produced. Right up through Berger's 2009 recent effort. So what accounts for the contrasting results? One key difference is that people in Milgram's studies took part alone, and that those in Gamson's were in groups. I'm going to highlight that. One key difference. And you don't feel so alone. We talked about that. So perhaps Michael Walzer was right. Disobedience, when it is not criminally, but morally, religiously, or politically motivated, is always a collective act. I think that's also going to be important. Michael Walzer said, his whole quote. So our earlier discussion of conformity indicated that the mere presence of one ally in an otherwise unanimous majority gives individuals the courage to dissent. The same may hold true for obedience. Notably, Milgram typically did not have more than one participant present in the same session. But in one experiment, he did use two Confederates who posed as co-teachers along with the real participant. In these sessions, one Confederate refused to continue at 150 volts, and the second refused at 210 volts. These models of disobedience had a profound influence on participants' willingness to defy the experimenter. In their presence, only 10% delivered the maximum level of shock. So when we feel alone with another person, there is no evidence of what they're doing. It can feel more dangerous personally. Maybe? I don't know, maybe. I think I'm going to, because there's a lot of meat in there, but it's not all together. So I'm going to have to also consolidate that one. We should add that the presence of a group is not a guaranteed safeguard against destructive obedience. Groups can trigger aggression, as we'll see in chapter 11. For example, the followers of Jim Jones were together when they collectively followed his command to die. And lynch mobs are just that, groups, not individuals. Clearly, there is power in sheer numbers. That power can be destructive, but it can also be used for constructive purposes. Indeed, the presence and support of others often provide the extra ounce of courage that people need to resist orders they find offensive. Okay, so I'm going to highlight the presence and support of others can often provide the extra ounce of courage. Okay, so we're almost done. Last section, guys. Chapter 7.5, the continuum of social influence. As we have seen, social influence on behavior ranges from the implicit pressure of group norms to the traps set by direct requests, to the powerful commands of authority. In each case, people choose whether to react with conformity or independence, with compliance or assertiveness, with obedience or defiance. I'm going to highlight that. People choose. From all the research, it is tempting to conclude that the more pressure brought to bear on people, the greater the influence. The more pressure brought down, the greater the influence. It is possible, however, that more produces less. In a series of studies, Lucien Conway and Mark Schlaller in 2005 cast participants in a corporate decision-making task in which they were asked to choose between two business options after watching others make the same decision. Consistently, the participants followed the group more when its members had formed their opinions freely than when they were compelled by a leader. Interesting. They followed the group more when there was perceived freedom. It appears that strong-arm tactics that force people to change their behavior may backfire when it comes to changing opinions. I think I'm going to highlight that sentence. That's more succinct than the other one. At this point, let's step back and ask two important questions. First, although different kinds of pressure influence us for different reasons, is it possible to predict all effects with a single overarching principle? Second, what does all the theory and research on social influence say about human nature? So, the social impact theory. Bib Latané in 1981 proposed that a common bond among the different processes involved in social influence lead people toward or away such influence. Specifically, he proposed the social impact theory, which states that social influence of any kind, the total impact of others on a target person, is a function of the other's strength, immediacy, and number. Key term, I don't know why I keep doing that, guys. Please ignore me. I think I'm also going to highlight that first sentence too. A common bond among the different processes involved leads people toward or away such influence. Yeah. According to Latané, social forces act on individuals in the same way that physical forces act on objects. Interesting. Consider, for example, how overhead lights illuminate a surface. The total amount of light cast on a surface depends on the strength of the bulbs, their distance from the surface, and their number, as illustrated in figure 710. The same factors apply to social impact. The strength of a source is determined by his or her status, ability, or relationship to the target. Highlight. The stronger the source, the greater the influence. I'm going to sub-highlight that too, because I'm going to use that as a bullet point underneath. When people view the other members of a group as competent, they're more likely to conform in their judgments. When it comes to compliance, sources enhance their strength by making targets feel obligated to reciprocate a small favor. And to elicit obedience, authority figures gain strength by wearing uniforms or flaunting their prestigious affiliations. Immediacy refers to a source's proximity in time and space to the target. Highlight. The closer the source, the greater its impact. Again, I'm going to also underscore that. Milgram's research offers the best example. Obedience rates were higher when the experimenter issued commands in person rather than from a remote location, and when the victim suffered in close proximity to the participant, he acted as a contrary source of influence, and obedience levels dropped. Consistent with this hypothesis, Latané and others in 1995 asked individuals to name up to 7 people in their lives and to indicate how far away those people lived and how many memorable interactions they had with them. In 3 studies, the correlation was the same. The closer others are, geographically, the more impact they have on us. I'm going to highlight that. The closer others are geographically, the more impact. And finally, the theory predicts that as the number of sources increase, so does their influence, at least up to a point. You may recall that when Ash in 1956 increased the number of live Confederates in his line judgment, studies from 1 to 4 conformity levels rose, yet further increases had only a negligible additional effect. Social impact theory also predicts that people sometimes resist social pressure. According to Latané, this resistance is most likely to occur when social impact is divided among many strong and distant targets, as seen in the right part of figure 710. There should be less impact on a target who is strong and far from the source than on one who is weak and close to the source. And there should be less impact on a target who is accompanied by other target persons than on one who stands alone. Thus, we have seen that conformity is reduced by the presence of an ally, and the obedience rates drop when people are in the company of rebellious peers. I'm going to highlight that sentence. People sometimes resist social pressure. Most likely to occur when social impact is divided among many strong and distant targets. Yeah, that's succinct enough. Yeah. All right, so over the years, social impact theory has been challenged, defended, and refined on various grounds. On the one hand, critics say that it does not enable us to explain the processes that give rise to social influence or answer why questions. On the other hand, The theory enables us to predict the emergence of social influence and determine when it will occur. Yep, that's getting highlighted. The theory enables us to predict when. Whether the topic is conformity, compliance, or obedience, this theory provides a stage for interesting new research in the years to come. A number of social psychologists have recently argued that social impact is fluid, dynamic, and an ever-changing process. Yep, that's getting highlighted. It just, you know, when you hear a sentence and you're like, that's a question. They're going to put it on there. It feels like a question. Latané and Leroux in 1996 thus refined the theory in that vein by having large groups of participants network through email, and by controlling their lines of communication, they found that the individuals within the network formed clusters. Over time, neighbors, participants who were in direct email contact with each other, became more similar to each other than did those who were more distant, not in direct email contact within the network. Referring to the geometry of social space, Latané and Leroux note that in the real world, immediacy cannot be defined strictly in terms of physical distance. Speculating on the role of technology, they noted that social impact theory has to account for the fact that remote social media may diminish the importance of physical proximity. Yep, that's getting highlighted too. Yeah, just that whole sentence, speculating on the role all the way to the importance of physical proximity. So, perspectives on human nature. It's the last little mini section. From the material presented in this chapter, what general conclusions might you draw about human nature? Granted, social influence is more likely to occur in some situations than in others, but are people generally malleable or unyielding? Is there a tilt toward accepting influence or towards putting up resistance? There is no single universal answer to these questions. As we saw earlier, some cultures value autonomy and independence. Others place greater emphasis on conformity. Even within a given culture, values may change over time. To demonstrate this point, ask yourself, if you were a parent, what traits would you like your child to have? When this question was put to American mothers in 1924, they chose obedience and loyalty as key characteristics of conformity. Yet when mothers were asked the same question in 1978, they cited independence and tolerance of others. Key characteristics of autonomy. Well, you look at the cultures, that makes a huge difference. They had just undergone a huge epidemic of the Spanish flu. There was this whole backlash from the repressive ideas of femininity and masculinity in the 20s. There's a reason why it was called the Roaring 20s. So if you talk to mothers in 1920 and all of these kids are super rebelling, wearing super short skirts when before they went to the ground and everybody was wearing dresses up to here and down to here and down to their ankles, and now these girls are chopping their hair off and wearing cute little flapper dresses. No wonder. And then you look at the mothers who have kids in 1978. Most women in 1978 were born in the late 60s or even mid 60s. Even if you are very generous, late 50s. Yeah, if they already had kids that were alive and raised. But I still think there's a stigma between women having children into their 30s at the time. So I'm trying to gauge for the actual cultural norm. But even if you look at that, they're kids of the 60s. it's a whole different culture, you know? So if you're raised in this permissive culture, or a culture that says, be at peace, be free, do what feels right for you, you're going to want similar things for your kids. This idea of tolerance for others and independence is, God, the definition of parents at that age. So I don't know. It seems like that would be the obvious thing that they would. Yeah, I'm sorry. I over explained an explanation that the book was giving. Duh. It's not just time that makes a difference. It's cultural evolution and the parents of the time. I get that. Moving on. Similar trends were found in surveys conducted not only in the United States, but in Western Germany, Italy, England, and Japan, and in laboratory experiments where conformity rates are somewhat lower today than in the past. Is it possible that today's children, tomorrow's adults, will exhibit more resistance to the various forms of social influence? If so, what effects will this trend have on society as a whole? And what will be the future effects of Facebook, Twitter, and other social media? Cast in a positive light, conformity, compliance, and obedience are good and necessary human responses. They promote group solidarity and agreement, qualities that keep groups from being torn apart by pure dissension. Cast in a negative light, a lack of independence, assertiveness, and defiance are undesirable behaviors that lend themselves to narrow-mindedness, cowardice, and destructive obedience, often with terrible costs. For each of us and for society as a whole, the trick is to strike a balance. I think the second to last one, yeah, that cast in a positive light. And that they promote solidarity and agreement and stop groups from being torn apart from dissension is good. And the cast in a negative light one. I like that they're showing a summary of those. I think 2 big bullet points about the differences between the two in positive outcomes and negative outcomes of conformity are really good. Yeah. Okay. We have finished chapter 7. I think maybe tomorrow I will go over a review, but I need a break for now because I've been talking for an hour. Okay. See you guys later. Bye.